If you've ever typed on a manual typewriter at your grandmother's desk, used a pocket calculator in a maths class, or seen a sleek orange typewriter displayed behind glass in a design museum, you've already met this company, even if the name never registered. Picture the weight of a letter 22 in your hands, the springy resistance of each key, the satisfying mechanical clack, 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 and then the small ratcheting zip of the carriage return. Cold metal, warm enamel paint, and a smell of oil and ribbon ink that clung to the case for decades. At its height, this company employed over 24,000 people in a single Italian town of barely 30,000 residents. It exported typewriters, calculators, and office machines to more than 100 countries. It built the machine that historians now recognize as the world's first desktop personal computer, a full decade before anyone in Silicon Valley had even sketched the idea. They survived 2 world wars. They survived the Great Depression. They survived the death of the founder's son in a car crash that some still call murder. They survived a hostile financial rescue that stripped away their most advanced division. They rebuilt, reinvented, and became Europe's largest computer maker. And then, less than 2 decades after reaching the summit of the entire industry, the company that invented the personal computer came within a few short years of disappearing from the map altogether. How does a company that was first, genuinely first, ahead of America, ahead of Japan, ahead of everyone, end up forgotten by the very industry it created? What happened inside those glass-walled factories on the banks of the Dora Baltea River? If you've ever typed on a manual typewriter at your grandmother's desk, used a pocket calculator in a maths class, or seen a sleek orange typewriter displayed behind glass in a design museum, you've already met this company, even if the name never registered. If you're new here and you like deep dives into the industrial stories nobody else tells, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This is the story of Olivetti. Chapter 1. A workshop behind the red brick wall. In 1868, in the small town of Ivrea, in the foothills of the Italian Alps, about 40 miles north of Turin, a boy was born into a Jewish family with deep roots in the local textile trade. His name was Camillo Olivetti. His father, Salvatore, ran a small wool business. His mother, Elvira Sacerdoti, came from a family that valued education above almost everything else, and young Camillo grew up in a household that read widely, argued about politics at the dinner table, and expected its children to make something of themselves. Camillo was not a conventional student. He studied engineering at the Polytechnic of Turin, but what shaped him most wasn't the classroom. It was what came after. In the early 1890s, he traveled to the United States, eventually working and studying in California, where he came face to face with something almost nobody in Italy had seen up close. American industrial method, assembly lines, standardized parts, workers who were paid more than their European counterparts, but produced far more in return. He saw the Remington typewriter factories. He saw how a machine, properly designed and properly built, could change the rhythm of an entire office, an entire profession. During his time in London on the way back, he had also spent time around the labor movements of the day, watching workers organize and argue for better conditions, an experience that, years later, would shape how he thought about the people who'd eventually work for him. He came home with notebooks full of ideas and very little money. Back in Italy, with 2 university classmates, Dino Gatta and Michel Ferrero, Camillo first tried his hand at importing and distributing other people's products. He became the Italian agent for an American bicycle brand and for a line of imported typewriters. It wasn't where his future lay. The real opportunity, he was convinced, wasn't selling other people's machines. It was building Italy's own. In 1896, back in Ivrea, Camillo founded his first venture, a small operation making electrical measuring instruments, the first of its kind in Italy. It was modest. A handful of workers, rented space, instruments built largely by hand. But it gave him something crucial: a workshop, a reputation for precision, and the confidence that Italian workers, properly trained, could build to the same standard as the Americans he'd watched. Ivrea remained the anchor. The detail that tells you everything about Camillo Olivetti is this. When he decided to build the factory, he designed the building himself. Red brick, topped with squared-off Guelph merlons. The same castle-style battlements you see on old Italian civic buildings. No flourishes, no grandeur for its own sake. A factory that looked like what it was: solid, serious, built to last. In 1908, Camillo took the gamble that would define the rest of his life. He founded Ingen C. Olivetti & C., a company with one purpose: to build Italy's first typewriter. At the time, this was not an obviously good idea. Italy had no domestic typewriter industry. Everything came from America: Remington, Underwood, Royal, shipped across the Atlantic at a price that put a typewriter out of reach for most Italian businesses, let alone individuals. Camillo had spotted the gap. He had seen the American factories. He believed an Italian company, in a small Piedmontese town most of the world had never heard of, could build a machine as good and sell it for less. He started with around 20 workers in that red brick building on what would become Via Jervis. 20 people, now tasked with building precision mechanical devices, to a tolerance that, if they got it wrong, would jam, skip letters, or simply fall apart within a year. This is the moment that sets the whole story in motion. A self-taught engineer's son with American know-how and Italian patience, betting his family's land and reputation on a machine that didn't yet exist in his own country. Chapter 2. The M1 and the First Proof. The machine that came out of that factory in 1911 was called the M1. It was Italy's first typewriter, and it looked deliberately like the best American machines of the era: a solid, businesslike device with a QWERTY keyboard and a sturdy cast frame. Each M1 weighed close to 17 kilograms, a cast iron and steel construction that felt, to anyone who lifted one, less like an office tool and more like a piece of machinery. The keys had a deep, deliberate travel, designed for clerks who would sit at the machine for 8 or 9 hours a day, and the type bars struck the page with a heavy, percussive clack that could be heard through a closed office door. It was not a quiet machine. It was not meant to be. The M1 was shown to the public at the Turin International Exhibition in 1911, marking Italy's 50th anniversary as a unified nation. For a company that had existed in its current form for barely 3 years, putting a finished working Italian-made typewriter in front of an international audience was an enormous statement of intent. It said, "This isn't a workshop experiment, this is a product." Production in those early years was small by any later standard, a few hundred machines a year, built largely by hand, with skilled mechanics fitting and filing components to make each typewriter work smoothly. But the company grew steadily. By the early 1920s, annual production had climbed into the thousands, and by 1929, over that first roughly 15-year stretch, Olivetti's machine production rose roughly tenfold, from around 1,300 typewriters a year to about 13,000. The company's first major crisis arrived almost exactly when you'd expect: the First World War. Italy entered the conflict in 1915, and like every manufacturer of precision mechanical goods, Olivetti found itself pulled toward war production. Military optics, fuses, components for the Italian armed forces. It was disruptive, but it also kept the factory running and its skilled workforce employed through years when many smaller Italian manufacturers simply closed. What came after the war was harder. Italy in the early 1920s was a country in economic chaos: runaway inflation, political instability, strikes, and the rise of fascism under Mussolini, who marched on Rome in 1922. For a company selling office equipment, a product that depends entirely on businesses having enough confidence in the future to invest in their administration, this was about as hostile an environment as you could design. Camillo Olivetti's response was to keep building, keep refining, and in 1920 launch the M20, a new and improved typewriter model that would become one of the company's most successful products of the interwar years. Then, in 1925, Camillo made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He sent his eldest son, Adriano, to the United States to do exactly what his father had done 30 years earlier, but this time as a fact-finding mission for the company itself. Adriano spent time studying American factories, including a period working on the line at a Ford plant, observing modern manufacturing and management techniques up close. Adriano came home in 1926 and went to work in the factory, at his father's insistence, starting as a laborer, not an executive, despite being the boss's son. It was Camillo's way of making sure his son understood the work from the inside before he was allowed to make decisions about it. What Adriano brought back from America wasn't just technical knowledge. It was a conviction, one that would take years to fully take shape, that a factory could be more than a place where people came to work for a wage. It could be organized, designed, and run in a way that improved the lives of everyone inside it. That conviction would become the foundation of everything Olivetti built over the next 3 decades, and eventually one of the reasons the company's later decline felt, to so many who lived through it, like a betrayal of something larger than a balance sheet. Chapter 3. The Glass Factory and the Machine That Typed Like Silk. By the early 1930s, Adriano Olivetti was the company's general director, and in 1932 his team launched the MP1, the company's first portable typewriter, a lighter, smaller machine aimed at professionals who needed to write on the move. In 1938, Adriano formally succeeded his father as president of the company. Camillo lived until 1943, watching his son build something far larger than the workshop he himself had started. What Adriano built in Ivrea through the 1930s, 40s and 50s was unlike any factory most workers had ever seen. Where the classic industrial factory of the era, and Adriano had Fiat's vast Turin works specifically in mind, was dark, dirty and loud, Olivetti's new buildings on Via Jervis were the opposite. Large windows, natural light flooding onto the factory floor, views out toward the Alps from the workbenches. The architecture was influenced by the Bauhaus movement and by Italian rationalist architects, and it was a deliberate, pointed contrast to the factories built under Mussolini's regime, a statement in steel and glass about what Adriano believed industry could be. The Via Jervis complex grew in stages, and each stage is still visible today, almost like growth rings in a tree. The original 1908 red brick building connected to a 1930s extension, then a wing built in 1949, and a final expansion completed around 1958. 4 distinct factories joined into one continuous complex. The central office building had an atrium at its heart with a grand staircase connecting 3 blocks arranged around it, designed deliberately to create a sense of arrival and unity for anyone walking in. It wasn't only Ivrea. In 1955, Olivetti opened a new factory at Pozzuoli near Naples on a hillside overlooking the Bay of Pozzuoli, one of the most striking stretches of coastline in southern Italy. The building was designed with floor-to-ceiling glazing, looking out over the water, with a color scheme for the interiors inspired by the ochres and reds of the nearby ruins at Pompeii. It had a canteen with sea views, a medical center, a library, and its own apprentice training center. For a region where industrial jobs were scarce, a modern glass-walled factory on a hillside was almost unheard of. By the late 1950s, More than 14,000 people had moved to Ivrea to work for Olivetti. At its peak in the 1970s, the workforce would reach around 62,000 employees worldwide. The product that, more than any other, came to define the company in this era was the Lettera 22, launched in 1950 at a price that put it within reach of more people. It weighed under 4 kilograms, light enough to carry in one hand in its case, the way you might carry a small overnight bag. It felt good to type on. The whole machine had a kind of mechanical confidence. Ernest Hemingway reportedly called it a traveling jewel. Writers, including Sylvia Plath and Gore Vidal, used one as their working tool. In 1954, it won the first ever Compasso d'Oro, Italy's most prestigious design prize, and in 1959, it was named the best designed product of the entire century. In November 1955, Adriano Olivetti made a decision that, on paper, looked like a strange use of money for a typewriter manufacturer. He established a new research laboratory, not in Ivrea, but in Barbaricina, near Pisa, roughly 170 miles to the south. Its purpose was to develop something Italy had never had, an Italian-built electronic computer. To run it, Adriano recruited a young engineer named Mario Chu, born in Rome to Chinese parents, educated partly in the United States at Brooklyn Polytechnic and Columbia, and by all accounts one of the most talented electronics engineers of his generation. Those who worked with him described him as warm, sincere, and immediately likable, a manager who put people at ease the moment they met him, in an industry not famous for that quality. Chu assembled a team and set a target, a working, sellable computer prototype within 3 years. They very nearly did it. By 1959, the Pisa laboratory had produced the Elea 9003, a transistor-based mainframe computer, one of the first fully transistorized computers in the world, built and sold commercially, while companies many times Olivetti's size were still working with vacuum tubes. Roughly 40 of the large Elea 9003 systems and over 100 smaller Elea 6001 scientific machines were built and leased to customers through to 1964. For a typewriter company, this was an almost unbelievable technical achievement and a direct challenge to IBM's dominance of the computer market. Then, in February 1960, Adriano Olivetti died suddenly of a heart attack while traveling by train near Lausanne, Switzerland. He was 58 years old. The man who had reshaped the company from a typewriter workshop into a global powerhouse was gone. Less than 2 years later, on 9th November 1961, Mario Cho, the man actually running the electronics program, was killed in a car accident near Milan. He was 37 years old. He died instantly. 2 leaders gone in 20 months. Some of the engineers would later describe the timing as almost impossible to believe, and a few suggested the crash deserved more scrutiny, though no evidence of foul play was ever established. With Adriano and Cho gone, the electronics laboratory, Italy's only serious attempt at building a domestic computer industry, was left without its protectors. The team kept going, relocating to a facility near Milan. But the company around them was about to be taken over by people who had never wanted the electronics division to exist in the first place. By 1963, Olivetti was in serious financial trouble, and the electronics laboratory, for all its brilliance, was a significant part of why. Developing computers from scratch, competing with IBM, was extraordinarily expensive, and Olivetti had also taken on a massive financial burden in 1959 by acquiring the American typewriter giant Underwood, a company that turned out to need far more restructuring money than anyone had budgeted for. Adding to the strain, Italy's central bank had imposed tight credit restrictions across the economy, making it harder for any large industrial company to borrow its way through a rough patch. In 1963, Giuseppe Pero, the manager who had overseen Olivetti's finances since the 1920s, died, removing the one figure inside the company with the deepest understanding of its books. By 1964, Olivetti's share price had collapsed, falling from around 11,000 lire to roughly 2,900 lire, and then down to about 1,500 lire, a loss of more than 85% of its value in a little over a year. The company needed a rescue, and it needed one fast. That rescue came in the form of what became known in Italy as the Gruppo di Intervento, the Intervention Group. It was a consortium of some of the most powerful financial and industrial names in Italy: Fiat, Pirelli, the state-backed lender IMI, and the investment bank Mediobanca. Roberto Olivetti spent much of 1963 traveling across Europe trying to raise capital independently, hoping to keep the family in control. He couldn't do it. Banks that should have lent to a company with Olivetti's reputation simply refused, one after another, until the family had no real alternative left but to accept the consortium's terms. The rescue worked, but it came with a price. The man who set that price was Vittorio Valletta, the chief executive of Fiat and the single most powerful figure in the intervention group. In Fiat's 1964 annual report, Valletta wrote that Olivetti was structurally solid, but that hanging over its future was a threat, un neo da estirpare, a blemish that needed to be cut out. That blemish was the electronics division. In 1964, the decision was formalized. Olivetti's entire electronics division, the computer line, the lab, the patents, the engineers, was sold to General Electric, the American conglomerate. Chapter 6. The machine that almost didn't exist. Here is the detail that never made the headlines at the time, and that almost nobody outside the small team involved knew about for years afterward. While the sale to General Electric was being negotiated through 1964, the team that had survived Mario Cho's death, Pier Giorgio Perotto, Giovanni De Sandre, and Gaston Garziera, were quietly finishing a project of their own, a desktop machine small enough to sit on an office desk. It wasn't part of the Elea mainframe line. It had started almost as a side project, something smaller, cheaper, and aimed at a market nobody else was targeting. Ordinary offices, laboratories, and engineering firms that needed serious computing power on an actual desk. As the General Electric deal moved toward completion, it became clear that everything classified internally as electronic computing equipment was going to GE as part of the sale. The new desktop machine fell into exactly that category. According to accounts from the team, the solution was almost absurdly simple. Over a series of nights, the machine's internal classification was quietly changed, from computer to calculator. Calculators were not part of the GE deal. The machine that would have gone to an American conglomerate instead stayed on paper as an Olivetti product, a calculator, nothing more, nothing General Electric would have any reason to want. The machine was finished in April 1964 and unveiled to the public on October 14, 1965, at the BEMA trade show in New York City, styled, with Olivetti's characteristic attention to design, by a young architect named Mario Bellini. It was called the Programma 101. The Programma 101 weighed about 35 kilograms and was priced at well over $30,000 today. It used around 900 transistorized circuit modules and stored programs on small magnetic cards, a primitive but genuinely workable form of personal data storage years before anything comparable existed elsewhere. At the New York unveiling, the Programma 101 quickly eclipsed everything else. Visitors were shown a demonstration in which it calculated a satellite's orbit in under 2 seconds, a task that would have taken room-sized mainframes hours. It went on to sell around 44,000 units. NASA bought several, and famously used Programmer 101 units to perform real-time orbital calculations during the Apollo program, including calculations related to the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. This is the historical irony. The world's first commercial desktop personal computer survived only because a handful of engineers secretly relabeled it to keep it out of the hands of General Electric. The first PC existed as an act of quiet defiance against the company's own management. Chapter 7. The long road to the top and the return of a familiar problem. Through the late 1960s and 1970s, Olivetti continued to grow, even without its original electronics division. The company developed electronic typewriters, banking terminals, telecommunications equipment, and, crucially, continued developing smaller computing devices, building on lessons learned from the Programmer 101. Pier Giorgio Perotto himself stayed with the company, and in 1967, Olivetti created a new General Research and Development Directorate and put him in charge of it, tasked with steering the company toward electronic office machines. Out of that period came products like the TC-800, an early intelligent electronic banking terminal, and the ET-101, the world's first fully electronic typewriter, alongside new generations of programmable calculators. By the late 1970s, the company employed a peak workforce of around 62,000 people and recorded sales of roughly 1.55 trillion lire. But the company was in financial trouble again, and once again, the solution came from outside. An Italian-Egyptian engineer and financier named Carlo De Benedetti took effective control of the nearly bankrupt company in 1978. De Benedetti became chief executive that year. He moved quickly and ruthlessly. Within months of arriving, he had reorganized the company's senior management almost entirely. De Benedetti's arrival is often told as a turnaround story, and on the numbers for a while, it was one. He pivoted Olivetti hard toward personal computers, riding the explosive growth of the PC market through the 1980s. By the mid-1980s, Olivetti was Europe's largest computer manufacturer, with a market value that, at its peak, briefly exceeded that of Fiat itself, a remarkable reversal. For a few years, it must have felt like vindication. The company was now one of the biggest computer companies in Europe, competing directly with IBM. But the foundations were less solid than they appeared. Olivetti's PC business depended heavily on partnerships and licensing arrangements, most notably a major deal with AT&T in the mid-1980s. As the PC market matured into the 1990s, it became a brutally low-margin business, dominated by manufacturers, first American clone makers, then increasingly Asian manufacturers, who could build machines more cheaply. By the early 1990s, the company that had ridden the PC boom was hemorrhaging money on the very business that had made it Europe's largest computer maker less than a decade earlier. If you've made it this far, that's a good sign you're enjoying the story. So now's the moment to hit subscribe if you haven't already, so the next deep dive lands in your feed automatically. Chapter 8. The Losses Mount. The 1990s were brutal for Olivetti, and the brutality came in waves, each one larger than the last. Olivetti's personal computer division, the crown jewel of the De Benedetti years, became an open wound. The company was now competing against manufacturers in Taiwan and elsewhere in Asia who could produce PCs at a fraction of the cost. Olivetti had a significant manufacturing presence at Glenrothes in Fife, building PCs and printers for the European market, but costs didn't fall fast enough to keep pace. Olivetti recorded escalating losses through the first half of the 1990s, losses large enough that, by the middle of the decade, serious people were using the word bankruptcy. The response was a series of restructurings, and restructuring meant one thing above all else: workforce reductions. Total headcount fell dramatically from its peak of 62,000. Plants were closed, divisions were spun off. The PC manufacturing operation, the business that had defined Olivetti's identity in the 1980s, was sold off in 1997. Carlo De Benedetti, who had genuinely made Olivetti look like Europe's answer to Silicon Valley, resigned in 1996 as the company continued sliding toward the brink. The Ivrea complex began to empty out. Buildings that had once housed 14,000 workers began to stand empty, their windows still letting in the alpine light, but onto rooms with no one left to use it. What almost nobody outside Ivrea understood at the time was just how completely the center of gravity had shifted. Olivetti was no longer primarily a maker of typewriters, calculators, or even personal computers. Under De Benedetti's successors, the company increasingly redirected its capital and its strategy toward an entirely different industry: telecommunications. The company that had built the machine NASA used to calculate Apollo trajectories was, by the late 1990s, primarily known in Italian financial circles for an audacious and, to many, reckless attempt to take over Telecom Italia, the country's former state telecoms monopoly, a takeover financed with enormous amounts of borrowed money. The bid succeeded, on paper. Olivetti took control of Telecom Italia in 1999, in what was at the time one of the largest hostile takeovers in European corporate history. But the debt taken on to fund it was so large that within a few years the relationship effectively reversed. Rather than Olivetti absorbing and revitalizing Telecom Italia, it was Telecom Italia's cash flows that ended up propping up Olivetti's enormous borrowings. And eventually, it was Telecom Italia that absorbed what remained of Olivetti, rather than the other way around. A company that had spent 90 years building typewriters, calculators, and computers ended its independent existence as a financial vehicle, swallowed by the very company it had once set out to take over. The story of Olivetti's decline was never primarily a financial story. It was a story about a town. For 3 generations, Ivrea's identity had been inseparable from Olivetti's. A flat in one of those blocks wasn't just where you lived. It was proof of an unwritten bargain. When the reductions of the 1990s hit, they hit a town that had no real alternative. Skilled precision mechanics found that those skills didn't transfer easily to other employers in a region that simply didn't have others of that kind. Some retrained, a mechanic in his 50s learning an entirely new trade. For people who had grown up believing an Olivetti job was a job for life, watching that certainty disappear was its own kind of bereavement. The asbestos issue compounded the human cost. Workers employed at the Ivrea plant between the 1960s and 1990s were, in a number of cases, exposed to asbestos fibers in ways that would not produce visible illness for decades. It would take until the 2020s for this to result in a criminal verdict. An Italian court found Carlo De Benedetti criminally responsible for failures connected to the asbestos exposure of 14 former workers who later died. Whatever the eventual outcome, the case meant that a court had formally found the human cost went beyond job losses. It meant the death of parents in a factory once celebrated as a model of how industry could treat its people. There was no single day when Olivetti closed. Its end was administrative and gradual. By 2003, what remained of the group became formally a subsidiary of Telecom Italia. The independent company did not survive. Today, Olivetti still exists as a brand name owned by TIM, used on a small range of products. But the low revenue figures illustrate the scale of what was lost about as starkly as any number can. The Ivrea factory complex itself has, in large part, simply been left standing. It is less a demolished factory than an abandoned one, a building still largely intact, still recognizably itself, simply empty. And yet, in 2018, UNESCO added Ivrea, Industrial City of the 20th Century, to its World Heritage List. The complex is now formally recognized as a site of global cultural significance. The factory that couldn't survive as a factory has, in part, survived as a monument to the idea that a factory could be something more than a factory. Chapter Final: The Silence and What Remains. So how does the company that built the world's first personal computer end up reduced to a brand name on point-of-sale terminals, its great factory left standing empty on the banks of the Dora Baltea? The answer is that it happened in two waves. In 1964, a consortium sold the company's most advanced technology to an American competitor. 3 decades later, in the 1990s, the PC industry Olivetti had collapsed in on the company itself. As for what happened inside those walls, it was this: a company that genuinely tried to prove that a factory could be beautiful, that workers deserved light and culture and dignity as much as a wage. But they slowly lost the battle to convince the people controlling its money that any of that mattered as much as the next quarter's figures. If you visit Ivrea today, the Via Gervis complex still stands, red brick and glass, exactly where Camillo built it and Adriano expanded it, in a town that still bears the family name. Some buildings are empty, others are monumental. What survives, beyond the buildings, is smaller but stubborn. The Archivio Storico Olivetti maintains the records, and design museums around the world, including MoMA in New York, hold Olivetti typewriters as masterpieces. Collectors around the world still seek out Olivetti typewriters and Programma 101 calculators, restoring them to work exactly as they did 60 years ago. The knowledge of what was achieved has never disappeared. Responsibility rests on a financial system that in 1964 valued the certainty of typewriters over the uncertainty of computers. It rests on a management culture that couldn't adapt to a global market Olivetti helped create. They had every chance to lead the PC revolution for decades. Someone, a consortium more interested in protecting other interests than in an Italian computer industry, chose not to let that happen. If your grandmother ever typed on a letter 22, you already know what was lost. Tell us in the comments. Which country are you watching from, and what part of this story surprised you the most?